American alien found a too-fat bride abandoned at the railroad station. He married her that same day. The locomotive's whistle pierced the morning air like a knife through silk, its mournful cry echoing across the vast Nebraska plains as steam billowed into the crisp autumn sky of 1887. At the dusty railroad station in the frontier town of Cedar Falls, a scene was unfolding that would be whispered about in parlors and saloons for decades to come, though few would ever believe the whole truth of what transpired on that remarkable October day. Margaret Rose Whitmore sat alone on a wooden trunk beside the train platform. Her voluminous burgundy traveling dress spread around her like the petals of some enormous wilted flower. Tears had long since dried on her round, pleasant face, leaving tracks through the dust and disappointment that had settled over her features like a veil. In her lap, she clutched a telegram that had arrived just moments before the westbound train's departure, its contents burning in her mind with each cruel word. "Changed my mind. You're not what I expected. Don't come to California. Harold." The other passengers had boarded and departed, leaving Margaret stranded 1,500 miles from her home in Philadelphia, with nothing but her trunk of carefully packed trousseau and a heart breaking so loudly she was certain the entire town could hear it. She had sold everything she owned to make this journey, responding to Harold Pemberton's advertisement for a mail-order bride, his letters full of promises about their future ranch and the love that would bloom between them like desert wildflowers after rain. Now she understood the terrible truth that her sister Eleanor had tried so gently to suggest during their final conversation. Harold Pemberton had been expecting someone different, someone smaller, someone who fit the narrow definition of feminine beauty that seemed to matter more than kindness or intelligence or the dozen other qualities that should have made a good wife. Margaret had been honest in her letters describing herself as a woman of substance and robust in health and spirit, but apparently those careful euphemisms had not prepared him for the reality of her generous figure. As she sat in the growing heat of the morning sun, surrounded by her scattered dreams and wondering how she would ever find the money to return home, Margaret failed to notice the approach of perhaps the most unusual traveler ever to set foot in Cedar Falls. The man who walked toward her from the direction of the town's single hotel moved with a peculiar grace, as if he were floating just slightly above the dusty ground, rather than walking upon it. His clothes marked him as a gentleman, a well-tailored dark suit, polished boots, and a hat that had clearly never seen the inside of a frontier general store. But there was something about his bearing that suggested he was not entirely what he appeared to be. Ezekiel Carter, as he had chosen to call himself in this life, this century, this small corner of the vast universe he had been exploring for longer than human civilization had existed, paused when he saw the woman sitting alone beside the railroad tracks. His eyes, which appeared merely blue to casual human observation, but actually perceived spectrums of light that had no names in any earth language, immediately recognized the electromagnetic signature of deep emotional distress, radiating from her like heat waves from desert stone. He had been living among humans for 47 years now, long enough to understand their complex social rituals around courtship and marriage, long enough to recognize the particular cruelty that his adopted species could inflict upon those who failed to meet arbitrary standards of physical attraction. In his travels across the American frontier, he had witnessed countless examples of human nature at both its finest and its most petty, but few things angered him more than the unnecessary causing of pain to innocent souls. Margaret became aware of his approach only when his shadow fell across her lap, providing blessed relief from the climbing sun. She looked up to see a face that was handsome in an unusual way, features that seemed almost too perfectly proportioned, skin that appeared untouched by weather despite his obvious travels, and eyes that held depths she couldn't quite fathom. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent she couldn't place, something that seemed to contain traces of languages from across the world, while belonging fully to none of them. He asked, with genuine concern coloring his words, if she required assistance, and Margaret found herself pouring out her story to this complete stranger with an openness that would have shocked her Philadelphia relatives. Perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes, or the way he listened without judgment, or simply the desperate need to tell someone about the humiliation and heartbreak that had brought her to this moment of complete desolation. Ezekiel listened to her tale with the patience of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, but his heart, an organ that functioned much like a human heart despite its origin among the stars of the Andromeda Galaxy, filled with a protective tenderness that surprised him with its intensity. Here was a woman of obvious intelligence and gentle spirit, cast aside for failing to conform to the shallow expectations of a man who clearly lacked the wisdom to recognize true worth when it was offered to him. As Margaret finished her story and apologized for burdening a stranger with her troubles, Ezekiel made a decision that would have shocked his own people back on the distant world he still sometimes thought of as home. He had spent decades observing human customs around marriage and partnership, had seen how these unions could provide stability, companionship, and mutual support in the harsh realities of frontier life. He had also seen how rare it was to find a human being with the combination of intelligence, kindness, and emotional depth that this woman possessed. What he said next would become the foundation of a love story that defied not only social conventions but the very laws of interplanetary protocol that governed his people's interactions with developing civilizations. He told Margaret Rose Whitmore that he was a man of some means, currently traveling west to establish a ranch in the Colorado Territory, and that he found himself in need of a wife who could serve as a true partner in building a life in that untamed land. Margaret's initial response was to assume that he was either mocking her or suffering from some form of temporary insanity brought on by the frontier sun. No man, especially not a man of his obvious refinement and resources, would propose marriage to a woman he had met 15 minutes earlier, particularly not a woman who had just been rejected for failing to meet another man's physical expectations. But something in his eyes, that same unfathomable depth that had drawn her initial confidence, convinced her that he was entirely serious. What followed was perhaps the most unusual courtship conversation in the history of the American West. Ezekiel, drawing upon decades of careful observation of human nature, explained that he had reached an age where he valued character and compatibility far above superficial considerations. He told her that their brief conversation had revealed qualities of mind and spirit that were far more important than conforming to arbitrary standards of physical appearance. He spoke of the ranch he intended to establish, of the need for a partner who could handle the intellectual and emotional challenges of frontier life, of his belief that mutual respect and genuine affection were far more solid foundations for marriage than the fleeting attraction that seemed to motivate most unions. His words painted a picture of a life that was both practical and romantic, grounded in reality but elevated by the possibility of true partnership between equals. Margaret found herself drawn into a conversation unlike any she had ever experienced. This man spoke to her as if her thoughts and opinions mattered, as if her intelligence was an asset rather than something to be hidden or apologized for. He asked about her education, her interests, her dreams for the future, and he listened to her answers with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly seen and valued. As their conversation continued, other travelers and townspeople began to notice the unusual pair beside the railroad platform. A well-dressed gentleman in deep discussion with a woman who was clearly in some distress was the sort of scene that attracted attention in a small frontier community where entertainment was scarce and gossip was a primary form of social currency. Old Pete Mackenzie, who ran the general store and served as the town's unofficial mayor, approached them with the sort of helpful busybody concern that characterized small-town life everywhere. He inquired if there was any assistance the lady might require, and when Ezekiel explained that they were discussing the possibility of marriage, Pete's weathered face lit up with the enthusiasm of a man who had just stumbled upon the most interesting story to hit Cedar Falls in months. What happened next demonstrated either remarkable efficiency or complete insanity, depending on one's perspective on such matters. Ezekiel asked Pete if the town had a minister capable of performing marriage ceremonies, and when Pete confirmed that Reverend Samuel Morrison was indeed available and had married dozens of couples over the years, Ezekiel turned to Margaret with a proposal that took her breath away. He suggested that they marry immediately, that very day, before the evening train arrived to take them west together toward their new life. He reasoned that if they were truly compatible, as their conversation seemed to indicate, there was no benefit to be gained from extended courtship rituals that would only delay their departure for Colorado. Pioneer life, he pointed out, required quick decisions and decisive action, and those who hesitated often found opportunities lost forever. Margaret's practical Philadelphia upbringing warred with something deeper and more instinctive that responded to this man's unexpected proposal. Everything about the situation violated the careful social protocols she had been taught since childhood. Proper courtships required months or even years of supervised interaction. Families were supposed to investigate the character and prospects of potential suitors, and marriage was a decision to be made with due deliberation, and extensive planning. But her practical upbringing had also taught her to recognize opportunity when it presented itself, and to understand that frontier life required adaptations that would have been unthinkable in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia society. This man was clearly educated, well-spoken, and financially stable. More importantly, he had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something worth valuing, rather than something to be discarded for failing to meet impossible standards. The debate that followed drew a crowd of nearly the entire town's population, all of whom had opinions about the wisdom of hasty marriages and the character of strangers who proposed to women they had just met. Some of the older women clucked disapprovingly about proper courtship procedures, while others pointed out that Margaret had few alternatives given her stranded circumstances. The men were divided between those who thought Ezekiel was either extremely generous or completely insane, and those who envied him for finding a solution to the perennial frontier problem of finding a suitable wife without spending years searching through the limited population of available women in any given territory. Reverend Morrison, when summoned from his morning study of scriptures, proved to be a pragmatic man who had performed enough frontier weddings to understand that conventional courtship rituals were often luxuries that circumstances didn't permit. After speaking privately with both Ezekiel and Margaret to ensure that neither was being coerced and that both understood the seriousness of marriage vows, he agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon. What followed was perhaps the strangest wedding in the history of Nebraska Territory. Margaret had no wedding dress except her traveling clothes, no family present to witness the ceremony, and no time for any of the preparations that usually preceded such momentous occasions. But the townspeople of Cedar Falls, caught up in the romance and excitement of the unexpected drama, rallied to provide what they could. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house offered her late mother's gold wedding ring, since Margaret had none and Ezekiel's simple gold band was clearly meant for a man's hand. Young Sally Morrison, the minister's daughter, picked wildflowers from the prairie to create a simple bridal bouquet. The owner of the town's single restaurant insisted on providing a wedding dinner for the couple and anyone else who wanted to join the celebration. As the afternoon progressed and word spread about the unusual wedding taking place at the railroad station, visitors arrived from neighboring farms and settlements, all eager to witness what was already being described as the most romantic event in the region's history. A woman abandoned by one man had been rescued by another in a display of frontier gallantry that restored everyone's faith in the possibility of true love triumphing over superficial concerns. What none of the witnesses could have known was that the groom brought to his wedding day experiences and perspectives that no human being had ever possessed. Ezekiel had witnessed the courtship rituals of dozens of species across multiple star systems, had studied the emotional and psychological patterns that governed pair bonding among sentient beings throughout the galaxy, and had spent decades observing human relationships with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist, studying an alien culture. But as he stood before Reverend Morrison and looked into Margaret's eyes as she spoke her marriage vows, something shifted in his understanding of what he had committed himself to. This was no longer an experiment in human social customs or an act of charitable assistance to a woman in distress. The emotions he felt were not the clinical interest of a researcher, but something far more profound and personal. Margaret, for her part, found herself speaking vows that she meant more deeply than she had ever expected to mean anything in her life. This man who had appeared from nowhere and offered her not just rescue but partnership had awakened something in her that she hadn't even known existed. Not just gratitude, though that was certainly present, but a recognition of compatibility and potential that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, and Ezekiel kissed his new bride with gentle reverence rather than passionate hunger, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard for miles across the prairie. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves caught up in the emotion of the moment, and more than one hardened frontiersman was seen wiping moisture from his eyes. The wedding dinner that followed became an impromptu town celebration, with fiddle music and dancing that continued until well after sunset. Margaret found herself the center of attention in a way that was entirely new to her experience, not as an object of pity or curiosity, but as the heroine of a romantic story that had captured everyone's imagination. As the evening progressed and the celebration gradually wound down, Margaret and Ezekiel found themselves sitting together on the porch of the hotel where they would spend their wedding night before catching the morning train to Colorado. For the first time since their remarkable day had begun, they were alone together, and the reality of what they had committed themselves to began to settle over them like the star-filled darkness of the prairie night. Their conversation, quiet and serious now that the excitement had passed, touched on practical matters of their immediate future and the deeper questions of what kind of marriage they hoped to build together. Ezekiel spoke of his ranch plans with the detailed knowledge of someone who had clearly given considerable thought to the challenges of establishing a successful operation in the Colorado Territory. But he also spoke of his hopes for their partnership in terms that revealed an understanding of marriage as something far more complex and rewarding than the simple domestic arrangements that characterized most frontier unions. He wanted a wife who could be a true collaborator in building their new life, someone whose intelligence and judgment he could rely upon when making the countless decisions that would shape their future. Margaret found herself responding to his vision with enthusiasm that surprised her. Her Philadelphia upbringing had prepared her to be an ornamental addition to some man's already established life, but Ezekiel was offering her something far more appealing, the chance to be a founding partner in creating something entirely new. As their conversation continued into the night, they discovered a remarkable compatibility of temperament and values that seemed to validate Ezekiel's impulsive proposal. They shared similar views on the importance of education, the value of hard work, and the principles that should guide relationships between people who cared about each other's well-being. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Margaret found Ezekiel's stories of his travels fascinating, though she noticed that his accounts of various places and events seemed to contain more detail and span more years than should have been possible for someone who appeared to be in his 30s. Ezekiel, for his part, was charmed by Margaret's wit and impressed by her practical intelligence and emotional wisdom. When they finally retired to their separate rooms, Ezekiel had insisted on this propriety despite their married status, saying that their relationship should develop naturally rather than be rushed by circumstances. Both carried with them the surprising realization that their hasty marriage might prove to be the beginning of something genuinely wonderful. The morning brought practical preparations for their journey to Colorado and the beginning of their new life together. Margaret's trunk was loaded onto the westbound train alongside Ezekiel's surprisingly modest luggage, and the couple prepared to leave Cedar Falls behind as the scene of their unconventional courtship and wedding. But before their departure, they received an unexpected visitor that would test the foundations of their new marriage in ways neither had anticipated. Harold Pemberton, the man whose cruel rejection had set the day's events in motion, arrived on the morning train from California with the intention of claiming the bride he had so callously discarded. Harold's appearance created a sensation that rivaled the previous day's wedding excitement. Here was the man who had abandoned Margaret for being too fat, now demanding his rights as her intended husband, apparently unaware that she had married someone else in his absence. His assumption that Margaret would be grateful for his return and willing to overlook his previous cruelty revealed a character that was both arrogant and obtuse. The confrontation that followed provided Ezekiel with his first opportunity to demonstrate the protective instincts that his marriage vows had awakened in him. When Harold attempted to assert his claim over Margaret and insisted that her marriage to Ezekiel was invalid due to his prior arrangement with her, Ezekiel's response revealed qualities that surprised even Margaret. Speaking with quiet authority that somehow commanded attention from everyone present, Ezekiel made it clear that Margaret was under his protection now, and that Harold's previous behavior had forfeited any rights he might have once possessed. His words were chosen with precision and delivered with a calm certainty that made Harold's bluster seem childish by comparison. But it was Margaret herself who delivered the most devastating response to Harold's presumptuous demands. Drawing upon reserves of courage and self-respect that her new husband's faith in her had helped to unlock, she told Harold exactly what she thought of his character and his treatment of her. Her words, delivered with the refined vocabulary of her Philadelphia education, but powered by genuine indignation, left Harold speechless and thoroughly humiliated. The scene concluded with Harold's retreat to the saloon, where he spent the morning drinking and complaining to anyone who would listen about ungrateful women and the breakdown of proper social order. The townspeople who had witnessed the entire drama made their opinion of his character clear through pointed silence and cold shoulders that eventually drove him back to the afternoon train, heading east. As Margaret and Ezekiel boarded their own train for the journey west, they carried with them not only the good wishes of an entire town, but also the satisfaction of having faced their first test as a married couple, with dignity and mutual support. The incident with Harold had revealed aspects of both their characters that boded well for their future together. The train journey to Colorado provided them with days of uninterrupted conversation and the opportunity to deepen their understanding of each other's backgrounds, values, and aspirations. Margaret shared stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her education, and her dreams of life beyond the restrictive social conventions of Eastern society. Ezekiel spoke of his travels, though Margaret noticed that his accounts often seemed curiously vague about specific dates and locations. What she couldn't have known was that Ezekiel was carefully editing his stories to exclude details that would have revealed his true nature. He spoke of learning agricultural techniques from various cultures, for instance, without mentioning that those cultures existed on different planets. He described his interest in astronomy and meteorology, without explaining that his knowledge came from direct observation of stellar phenomena and atmospheric conditions across multiple worlds. As their train carried them across the vast expanse of the American West, through landscapes that ranged from prairie grasslands to mountain forests to high desert plateaus, Margaret found herself falling genuinely in love with the man she had married so impulsively. Not the desperate gratitude she had initially felt, but something deeper and more substantial: respect for his intelligence, appreciation for his kindness, and attraction to his quiet strength. Ezekiel, meanwhile, was experiencing emotions that he had never expected to feel. His people were capable of affection and companionship, but the intense personal connection that was developing between him and Margaret was entirely outside his previous experience. The protective tenderness he felt toward her, the pleasure he took in her conversation, and the way her happiness had become important to his own sense of well-being were all new territories in his vast catalog of experiences. Their arrival in Colorado territory marked the beginning of the next phase of their remarkable story. The ranch that Ezekiel had described during their courtship proved to be real and even more impressive than his modest descriptions had suggested. Located in a valley between mountain ranges that offered both spectacular views and practical advantages for agriculture and livestock, the property showed clear evidence of careful planning and substantial investment. What impressed Margaret most was not the obvious prosperity of the operation, but the thoughtful way it had been designed to work in harmony with the natural landscape. The house, barns, and other structures seemed to grow organically from their surroundings, and the fields and pastures had been laid out to take advantage of natural water sources and soil conditions in ways that suggested deep understanding of ecological principles. The ranch hands who worked the property welcomed their new mistress with respectful enthusiasm, though Margaret noticed that they seemed to regard Ezekiel with a deference that went beyond the usual relationship between employer and employee. There was something almost reverential in the way they listened to his instructions, as if his knowledge of ranching matters was so comprehensive that questioning it would be foolish. What Margaret didn't realize was that Ezekiel's understanding of agriculture, animal husbandry, and land management came from centuries of studying such systems across dozens of worlds. His seemingly intuitive grasp of weather patterns, soil chemistry, and ecological relationships was actually the result of scientific knowledge that wouldn't be discovered by human scientists for another century. As the weeks and months of their marriage progressed, Margaret discovered that life with Ezekiel was unlike anything she could have imagined during her sheltered Philadelphia upbringing. He treated her not as a domestic servant or decorative addition to his household, but as a true partner whose opinions and insights were valuable contributions to their shared enterprise. She found herself involved in every aspect of ranch management, from financial planning to strategic decisions about crop rotation and livestock breeding. Ezekiel seemed to genuinely value her analytical mind and practical intelligence, often asking for her thoughts on complex problems and implementing her suggestions with gratifying frequency. But perhaps most remarkably, he never seemed to notice or care about the physical characteristics that had led to her abandonment by Harold Pemberton. When he looked at her, Margaret felt seen and appreciated for who she was rather than judged against some impossible standard of conventional beauty. His attention and affection seemed to be based on qualities that would only grow stronger over time rather than fade with age or circumstance. Their physical relationship developed gradually and naturally, without pressure or expectations that might have made Margaret uncomfortable. Ezekiel approached their intimate life with the same thoughtful consideration he brought to every other aspect of their relationship, seeming to understand instinctively that trust and emotional connection were the foundations upon which everything else should be built. As their first year of marriage progressed, Margaret began to notice certain peculiarities about her husband that might have concerned a less trusting wife. He seemed to require very little sleep, often spending hours of the night standing outside and gazing at the stars, with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. His knowledge of weather patterns was uncannily accurate, allowing him to predict storms and seasonal changes with precision that impressed even longtime residents of the territory. Most surprisingly, he seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to communicate with the animals on the ranch. Horses that were skittish with other handlers became calm and cooperative in his presence. Cattle would move where he wanted them to go with minimal effort on his part. Even wild animals seemed to recognize him as something different and special, showing no fear when he approached them. Margaret attributed these unusual qualities to extensive travel and natural talent, never suspecting that her husband's abilities stemmed from technologies and knowledge that were literally out of this world. Ezekiel had installed subtle monitoring and communication devices throughout the ranch that provided him with detailed information about weather patterns, animal behavior, and potential threats. His apparent intuition was actually the result of data analysis capabilities that far exceeded anything available to human science. Their second year of marriage brought challenges that tested the strength of their partnership in new ways. A severe drought threatened the livelihood of every ranch and farm in the territory, and many of their neighbors faced the prospect of losing everything they had worked to build. While others watched their crops wither and their livestock suffer, Ezekiel somehow managed to maintain adequate water supplies and keep his operation functioning. Margaret noticed that he spent increasingly long nights outside during this period, and she began to suspect that he was doing something to help their struggling neighbors. Her suspicions were confirmed when several nearby ranchers mentioned that they had found new water sources on their properties after Ezekiel had visited to offer his assistance and advice. What she didn't know was that Ezekiel was using advanced geological scanning equipment to locate underground water sources, and then employing carefully targeted energy pulses to create new springs and wells. His interventions appeared to be the result of exceptional skill in water divining and well drilling, but they were actually sophisticated applications of technology that wouldn't be available to humans for generations. The crisis brought out qualities in both Margaret and Ezekiel that deepened their respect and affection for each other. Margaret organized relief efforts among the ranch wives, coordinating food distribution and medical care for families whose resources had been exhausted by the drought. Her leadership and compassion during this difficult period earned her a permanent place in the hearts of their community. Ezekiel's efforts to help their neighbors, meanwhile, revealed the depth of his commitment to the human community he had chosen to join. He could have used his advanced capabilities to protect only his own interests, but instead he chose to share his advantages in ways that helped everyone survive the crisis. His actions during the drought established him as a leader whose wisdom and generosity could be relied upon in times of trouble. As their marriage entered its third year, Margaret and Ezekiel settled into patterns of partnership that seemed to grow stronger and more satisfying with each passing season. Their ranch had become the most successful operation in the territory, not through exploitation or advantage-taking, but through intelligent management and innovative techniques that other ranchers were beginning to adopt. Margaret had grown into her role as a rancher's wife with confidence and skill that impressed everyone who knew her. The shy, uncertain woman who had been abandoned at a railroad station had been transformed into a capable leader who was respected throughout the territory for her intelligence, integrity, and generous spirit. Their love story had become something of a legend in the region, told and retold as an example of how true partnership could triumph over superficial concerns and social conventions. The hasty marriage that had begun as an impulsive rescue had evolved into a relationship that served as a model for other couples seeking to build lives based on mutual respect and shared values. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story was still unknown to everyone, including Margaret herself. Ezekiel's decision to marry her had been more than an act of compassion, or even an expression of growing affection. It had been a choice that violated the most fundamental laws governing his people's interaction with developing civilizations. Members of his species were forbidden from forming permanent emotional attachments to humans, were prohibited from interfering in human social structures beyond the minimum necessary for protective observation, and were absolutely banned from introducing advanced technologies into human society in ways that could accelerate cultural development. By marrying Margaret, by establishing a ranch using advanced techniques, and by intervening to help their neighbors survive the drought, Ezekiel had broken nearly every regulation that governed his presence on Earth. His actions had been reported by other members of his species who maintained surveillance of all off-world agents, and official censure was inevitable. The message, when it finally came, arrived through communication channels that appeared to Margaret to be nothing more than her husband receiving an important business letter. Ezekiel was ordered to terminate his marriage, abandon his human identity, and report immediately for reassignment to a monitoring post in a distant star system, where he would have no opportunity for further unauthorized cultural interference. The choice he faced was one that no member of his species had ever confronted. He could obey orders and return to the life of detached observation that had been his role for decades before he met Margaret, or he could choose exile from his own people in order to remain with the human woman who had become more important to him than loyalty to ancient protocols. That night, as Margaret slept peacefully beside him, Ezekiel stood at their bedroom window and looked up at the stars that had once been his highway between worlds. Somewhere among those points of light was the home he had known for centuries before coming to Earth. There were friends, colleagues, and family members who would consider him a traitor if he chose to remain with Margaret, rather than honor his obligations to their civilization. But here, in this simple ranch house in the Colorado Territory, was the life he had built with a woman whose courage, intelligence, and capacity for love had taught him things about existence that all his advanced education had never revealed. Here was a partnership based on genuine affection and mutual respect, a daily life filled with purpose and satisfaction, and a future bright with possibilities that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with choice and commitment. When Margaret woke the next morning, she found Ezekiel sitting beside their bed, fully dressed and holding a letter that had clearly been the bearer of serious news. Her heart immediately filled with concern as she recognized the expression on his face, not grief or fear, but the look of a man who had been forced to make a decision that would change everything. He told her, as gently as he could, that his past was catching up with them in ways that could threaten the life they had built together. Without revealing the full truth about his alien origins, he explained that he had obligations to people from his past that conflicted with his commitment to their marriage and their ranch. Margaret listened with the calm intelligence that had first attracted him to her, asking careful questions and offering insights that helped him clarify his own thinking about the choice he faced. When he had finished explaining as much as he could without revealing dangerous truths, she surprised him with her response. She told him that she had known from the beginning that there were things about his past that he couldn't or wouldn't share with her, and that she had chosen to trust him despite those mysteries. If he was now facing a choice between his old life and their life together, she wanted him to make that decision based on what would make him truly happy, rather than what would satisfy others' expectations. Her words, spoken with the wisdom and generosity that had characterized their entire relationship, gave Ezekiel the courage to make the choice that his heart had already embraced. He would refuse the order to return, would accept exile from his own people, and would commit himself completely to the human life he had chosen to build with Margaret. The formal response he sent through secure channels was brief and unambiguous. He was resigning his commission, renouncing his citizenship, and choosing permanent exile on Earth with the understanding that he would never again be welcome among his own kind. The message was received with shock and disappointment by his superiors, but also with a grudging respect for the courage required to make such a sacrifice for love. Years passed, and the ranch continued to prosper under the management of the couple who had found each other through chance and chosen each other through commitment. Margaret and Ezekiel aged together, though she sometimes noticed that her husband seemed to age more slowly than she did, maintaining his strength and vitality, even as her own hair grew gray and her movements became less spry. They never had children, though whether by choice or circumstance Margaret never knew. But they filled their lives with purpose and connection in ways that made their childless state seem like a deliberate design rather than a loss. They mentored young couples just starting their own ranches, provided employment and guidance for countless workers, and became pillars of a community that had grown and prospered around the foundation of their successful partnership. In quiet moments, usually in the evenings when they sat together on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Margaret sometimes wondered about the mysteries that still surrounded her husband. His knowledge seemed too vast for any normal education, his insights too profound for ordinary experience, and his love for her too complete for someone who had lived as solitary a life as his story suggested. But she had learned that some questions were less important than the answers that daily life provided. Ezekiel loved her completely, treated her with respect and consideration, and had built with her a life of meaning and satisfaction that exceeded anything she had ever imagined possible. Whatever secrets he carried from his past were less significant than the present they shared, and the future they continued to build together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they celebrated with friends and neighbors who had witnessed their remarkable partnership over the decades, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. A cruel rejection that had seemed like the end of her dreams had instead been the beginning of a love story that had transformed not only their own lives, but the entire community around them. The woman who had once sat weeping on a railroad platform, convinced that no one would ever see past her physical imperfections to appreciate her true worth, had become the respected matriarch of a ranch that served as a model for the entire territory. The man who had once wandered between worlds without permanent attachments had found in her the home and family that made exile from his own people seem like a fair exchange. As evening fell and their guests departed, Margaret and Ezekiel found themselves once again sitting together on their porch, looking up at the stars that had witnessed their improbable courtship and blessed their enduring marriage. Neither spoke of the mysteries that still lay between them, but both understood that some love stories transcend the boundaries of conventional understanding. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying new travelers toward unknown destinations and uncertain futures. Margaret smiled, remembering another train and another platform where two souls had found each other against all odds. Sometimes, she thought, the most important journeys began not with careful planning, but with the courage to say yes to unexpected possibilities. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, some of them warming worlds where Ezekiel's people continued their work of observation and protection, others shining down on the small ranch where two beings from different worlds had chosen to build a life together based on love, respect, and the daily miracle of partnership freely chosen and faithfully maintained. Their story had become legend in Cedar Falls and throughout the Colorado Territory, told and retold as evidence that true love could triumph over superficial judgments and social conventions. But the deepest truth of their marriage, that love could bridge not only differences of background and appearance but the vast distances between species and worlds, remained their secret, a testament to the power of connection that transcends every boundary except the willingness to choose each other, again and again in the face of any obstacle or opposition. As they finally rose to go inside for the night, Margaret took her husband's arm with the comfortable familiarity of 20 years of shared life, and Ezekiel looked down at her with the same wonder and gratitude he had felt on that first day, when she had trusted a stranger with her story and accepted his improbable proposal. Some gifts, he had learned, were worth any price, and some love stories were too precious to be limited by the rules of any single world or civilization. The night settled over their ranch with the peace that comes from lives well lived and love well chosen, and in the quiet of their bedroom, two beings from different worlds shared the contentment that can only be found when home is not a place but a person, and when love is not a feeling but a decision made new each day.